victory in Europe, that the European phase of the war ended 75 years ago yesterday, or potentially today, if you believe the Russians. And we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation here as to when the real surrender day should be located. Again, the image on the right is joyous celebrations in New York. And you see the one woman has a Germany surrender sign. And this is different than the more famous Eisenstadt photo of VJ Day, the surrender of Japan in September, but something similar. All right, let's see. There we go. All right, obviously World War II is associated very closely with Nazi Germany and the rise of Adolf Hitler. I'm assuming that most of the folks tuned in here know a little bit of background about that, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But you know, one of the things historians, I believe, will be debating 100 years from now is how in the world could a cultured, civilized country like Germany turn their destiny over to a madman, a racist madman who would plunge their country into ruin. And I think, again, that's why history is so valuable as a guide to all of us, in that you have to look at where Germany was in 1918. World War I had just concluded. Millions of Germans were dead in a failed war. An Allied blockade prevented food from being imported into Germany. Millions were starving. Tens of thousands would die. So the country was devastated by a lost war and all the lost treasure and men that had been impacted by that. The Treaty of Versailles caused the victorious Allied powers wanted to punish Germany, so they made them pay for the cost of the war with reparations. That crushed the economy, created great inflation. Money couldn't be printed fast enough to deal with the inflation, and the savings of the middle class in particular was wiped out overnight. Ironically, thanks to the United States, the terms of the reparations were eased in the mid-20s, and the Nazi Party actually, their percentage of the vote in the German elections declined massively from 1924 to the 1928 national elections. They were a fringe party with less than 5% of the vote. So it looked like that level of extremism had been at least dealt with. But then Germany was faced, as the world was faced, with another massive calamity, the Great Depression, the stock market crash of 1929, and the massive unemployment that resulted. We have just, here in America, passed the 15% unemployment figure with 33 million unemployed. Germany had even higher percentages and millions of their own unemployed. And for the unemployed, without the social welfare net that hopefully we have today, their choices, the mainstream centrist parties had less appeal, and people either had to make a choice between communism or National Socialism, as they called it. And this poster here in German is Our Last Hope, Hitler. And in 1932, they were able to garner not 50%, but close to 50%, to have the majority in their Reichstag, their parliament, and with the help of a small nationalist party, were able to gain 50% of the power and 50% of the Reichstag, and then eventually pass a enabling act, which gave Hitler unlimited powers. So his aggressive tendencies, desire to right the wrongs of World War I and to expand into the East would lead to war. Now, in that same time, on the other side of the globe, Imperial Japan here, this is General Tojo, the aggressive war promoting leader of Japan in the 1930s and through the beginning of World War II. As early as 1931, they had attacked China and seized Manchuria. You see that on the map in the upper left. And the world stood idly by and allowed that to happen. And then in 1937, they attacked China proper. And a war was raging for 2 full years between Japan and China before World War II would break out in Europe when Germany attacked Poland in 1939. So Japan was under the sway of basically a military clique that believed in what they called Bushido. You see that in the lower right, the way of the warrior from samurai days. A very harsh militaristic credo that believed in Japanese expansionism, Japanese racial superiority, to others in the Pacific and throughout the world. All right, so fast forwarding to our war and when we got involved, of course, that was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor as a result of sanctions that we had imposed on Japan because of their war with China, in particular an oil embargo. Japan felt that they either had to get out of China, and that was not in the cards for them, or attack the United States and all the Western allies in the Pacific. And they would do so on December 7, 1941. So I think this might be a good time for our first quiz, if I can remember how to do that. Quiz Master Nathan, can you throw quiz number 1 at us here? Or do I need to click on something? Nope, Quiz Master Nathan has done it. Thank you, Quiz Master Nathan. All right, so for you folks out there, what war was known as the war to end all wars? Was it the Civil War, World War I, World War II, or the Cold War? So I'll give you time to vote and see what you think about that. So we're going to have to leave it to Quizmaster Nathan to see how many of our participants now have voted, and he'll let us know when the time is right for ending the quiz. He's taken it off the screen, and there are our results. Wow, we've got an educated group here. Nobody fell for the Cold War or the Civil War. A couple of folks went with World War II. Obviously, our answer is World War I. Woodrow Wilson in attempting to get Americans to back this war. And people always seem to oversell wars. That's my little soapbox thing here for the moment as to what they're going to accomplish. We saw some of that with our Iraq war as well in our time. But Wilson thought that war would make the world safe for democracy. And of course, it was basically a 20-year pause that would lead to World War II 20 years later. All right, so Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the date which will live in infamy is our story there. So America had been very divided about the urgency of getting involved in World War II. And the attack on Pearl Harbor ended that and caused the country to rally around the flag and support the war effort and getting America involved in both the European and Pacific theaters. Now, actually, for 4 days, Germany, fortunately for the Roosevelt administration, Germany took 4 days and then they declared war on the United States. It's one of those great what ifs of history is would be Roosevelt been able to convince Congress to declare war on Germany, absent Germany declaring war on us first. But Germany removed that possibility by declaring war on the United States. So a grand alliance was formed, and I'm sure most of you know who these folk are here. Seated in the chair, Winston Churchill, the leader of Great Britain, our President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Photos from Yalta, February 1945. So you can see how frail Roosevelt has become. He would only have a couple more months to live. And then Marshal Stalin, Uncle Joe, as he was called euphemistically by our press that were supportive of the Soviet Union's war effort. And then the cartoon in the upper right shows the big three, as they were called. Checking in on a sick world and seeing how are we feeling today. And you see Stalin checking the pulse there, or maybe he's attempting to steal a wristwatch. I'm not certain. But the key aspect of this, despite the fact that Americans wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, the big three quickly decided that Germany was the greater threat and that they needed to unite together to stamp out Nazism. So the vast bulk of America's war fighting ability would go to Europe, and not exclusively. There were a couple of things that, the Pacific War would continue onwards, but including a lot of our Navy and air power as well would go to those theaters. But generally, the thought was that it was Europe first. Let's see, I'm having an issue here with my power. 1 second. It says battery's running low. I thought I plugged in here. Oh, it wasn't fully plugged in. Apologize for that. I think we've got it taken care of now. All right, that was good morning. All right, here is another cartoon, again, emphasizing the importance of the Soviet Union. There's Papa Joe, Uncle Joe. He's already gathered in all the chips about Europe, and he's about to grab China and India as well from a befuddled John Bull and Uncle Sam. Bull looks befuddled. Uncle Sam just is stroking his beard as to how serious this is going to be. But one of the things we cannot forget, and this is not Vladimir Putin propaganda, but the Soviet Union did the vast majority of the fighting and inflicted the vast majority of the casualties on the Germans, the Wehrmacht as it was called. Upwards of 80% of every German soldier who was killed in World War II was killed as a result of the Red Army, the Red Air Force, and the Soviet Union. Hitler attacked Russia in June of 1941, and despite Winston Churchill's lifelong opposition to communism, he has professed to say that if Hitler invaded hell itself, he would be tempted to say a good word for the devil in Parliament. So aid from both Britain and the United States went to the Soviet Union, so-called Lend-Lease, but the Soviets lost huge chunks of their territory, and upwards of close to 20 million Soviet citizens and soldiers would die before Nazism was crushed. You all heard probably the battles of Moscow and Stalingrad. The map on the lower right shows the high water mark of the German invasion in November 1942, and then the arrows show how over 1943 and then to June of 1944, in very, very hard fighting, the Germans were gradually thrown off of Soviet territory, and Eastern Europe, the Red Army was on the verge of Eastern Europe. All right, so our war, the United States fights Germany and Italy. The first things that we could do before we could actually send an army over to Europe was the naval war, the Battle of the Atlantic. And the U-boat war was vital in getting supplies and food and weapons over to Great Britain. And the major aspects of victory for the United States and Great Britain in those wars were the adoption of a convoy system. We should have learned a lesson in World War I, but it took a while. And eventually we'd instead of sailing individual ships, they would be gathered together in great convoys and escorted by British and American warships. Technological advances, sonar and radar, the ability to detect submarines underwater or when they were surfaced. They have to surface to really to make speed and get to locations. So radar, particularly airborne radar, would allow us to identify where those submarines were. So-called escort carriers, or they sometimes call them jeep carriers because they were so small, little aircraft carriers that could have 15 to 20 planes on them and provide air cover for the convoys. Those were not brought into play until late 1942, early 43. And then U.S. shipyards, the ability of our shipyards, including here in California, to pump out merchant ships and warships. And in I had a thesis once before that really the most important contributors to it's wrong more, American victory was our shipyard workers, in particular women, Rosie the Riveters, who produced the armaments of war and were put to work in American factories and shipyards, and they deserve a large share of credit for our victories. So this little thing coming up here shows the casualties from that fight in the Atlantic, and you see numerous merchant vessels, 36,000 sailors, and the Germans, the Axis, and the Germans and the Italians paid a very high price. 783 of their submarines were sunk, 30,000 sailors killed. For the Germans, roughly 3/4 of every sailor who went into a U-boat would not return, and those are pretty high casualty rates. And then this last quote here from Winston Churchill demonstrates how important the Battle of the Atlantic was. He called it the dominant factor. Never for one moment could we forget that everything happening elsewhere on land, sea, and the air ultimately depended on its outcome. All right, speaking of that air, again, before we could send forces over to Europe, we did send our air forces over there, the 8th Air Force in England in particular. And you see the stats that come up. Over the next 4 years, from 41 to 45, almost 3 million tons of bombs would be dropped on Europe, vast majority on Germany proper. American planes would attack during the day in so-called precision bombing, looking for individual targets like factories, railroad marshalling yards, etc., barracks. Whereas the British found that that was too costly. Too many British planes would be shot down. by German Luftwaffe fighters during the day, so they would attack at night. And since you couldn't see your targets as well at night, they went for what was called area bombing, particularly with incendiaries, fire bombs, to start German cities on fire and to, quote, dehouse the workers who worked in the factories rather than bomb the factories themselves. So again, people will be debating for decades about the relative merits of both of those strategies, but it did contribute by 1944 at least to gravely damaging Germany's ability to produce the weapons of war. The slide up at the top, by the way, shows image up at the top shows one B-24 bomber, American bomber, almost crashing into another. Just as a quick aside, we were briefly contacted, just have been recently contacted by a citizen in Austria who was seeking to get information from us because a B-24 crashed into another B-24 outside Wiener Neustadt, Austria, where this gentleman lives. And he has some details about, including pieces of the plane. And he found us on the internet because a Red Letter Lieutenant William Dawson was one of the pilots of the two planes. So we're going to try to flesh out that story and make a connection with him. All righty, so land campaign. We knew that as much as air power could damage a nation, you really had to have boots on the ground and occupy, go right all the way to Berlin if necessary. Americans were pressing to invade France as early as 1942. Churchill and the British talked us out of it, I think, fortunately, because our army was not ready. And instead, they advocated for invading French North Africa in Morocco and Algeria. You see the red arrows there. And to defeat Rommel and to, who is in Libya off to the right here, actually back in Egypt, even further to the right at this point, to secure the Mediterranean and put pressure on Benito Mussolini and the fascist Italians. We weren't happy with that. We wanted to attack Germany proper through France. Stalin and the Russians were very angry about that. They again feel that they're bearing the whole brunt of the war, while we go into what is a sideshow. In any event, we did invade North Africa, neutral in the French Vichy North Africa. You see Vichy France there up on the top. The fascist supporting remnant of France that was set up after France was conquered by the Nazis in June of 1940. We had diplomatic relations, believe it or not, with Vichy France. We had an ambassador there and recognized them as the legitimate government of France. So it was interesting diplomatically or legalistically as to why we were attacking their territories of Morocco and Algeria. And for 4 days, the French actually fought us. Approximately 1,000 American casualties would result in those 4 days fighting the French, our erstwhile allies, who surrendered after 4 days and then assisted us in kicking the Germans out of Tunisia. And the Italians, you see that over there on the far right. The images on the right, that is actually not Tunisia, but that is our Mojave Desert, that's German tank there. Patton's testing grounds are out at Chiricahua Summit, and there's a great museum, the Patton Museum out there, that I recommend to folks. Our army suffered a bloody nose at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. You see that lower right there, the image. When the Germans counterattacked, Rommel counterattacked in February of 1943. What they thought would take just a couple weeks to clear out North Africa would actually take all the way till May of 1943, 6 full months. Our army suffered a major defeat and needed to really reorganize and get some experience. War was not as easy as we thought it was going to be. And again, based on the Kasserine Pass incident, it's probably a real good idea that we did not invade France in 1942. All right, so the question next became where to go. Again, George Marshall and the Americans wanted to get back to invading France. But Churchill, oh, I forgot one major aspect here before I get over to France. One of the things that I'm big on, and books are great. I've got a whole library of World War II books. I can recommend some to you if you want to email me afterwards. But for a lot of folk, it's movies that give them a little flavor of what these historic events were all about. And the scenes about the North African invasion in Kasserine Pass and how Patton came to take over the control of at least the tanks in Northwest Africa are very well done in this movie Patton from 1970 that I recommend to you. All right, so now back to our strategy for 1943. The same folk were advocating that we attack into France, but Churchill was able to convince Roosevelt basically that seize upon our momentum in North Africa. You see Tunisia and the map there on the lower left, and invade first Sicily and then Italy proper, so as to knock Italy out of the war. They had gotten involved in the war in July of 1940 and had suffered really from disaster after disaster, as depicted in the Russian cartoon in the middle there, showing a woe-begone barefoot Mussolini sitting on the boot of Italy that's falling apart. So we did invade Sicily in July of 1943, and that image on the lower right shows that with our naval power. And quickly, Italy did sue for peace and left the Axis, changed sides, and when we invaded in Salerno in September of 1943. And the Germans, however, rushed in reinforcements, and taking advantage of the mountainous terrain of Italy, were able to stop the Allied advance. You see on the map in the upper right there, by the winter of 1943-44, our advance had stalled and appalling conditions, and it looked like a stalemate there, and casualties were rising. All righty, so then we can fast forward to the long-awaited invasion of France. Again, based on our North Africa experience, based on the Italian experience, it was probably for the best that we waited as long as we did, and also let the Red Army bleed the Germans dry on the Russian front, the Eastern Front. So after months of preparation, the world's largest amphibious invasion would take place in June of 1944 at D-Day. And I've got a whole separate presentation on D-Day. Some of you may be participating in the webinar right now. Joined Maria and I for a trip to Normandy last June, in which we visited many of these important sites. And again, if you do have this opportunity in the post-COVID world, it's really difficult to understand American history. I shouldn't say that. A better comprehension of American history can be achieved by standing on the sand at Omaha Beach and visiting that cemetery that's over that bluff, and getting a better understanding of the bravery and courage of the men who assaulted that beast and those who gave their lives to end the scourge of Nazism. Quizmaster Nathan, this might be a good time for quiz number 2, I think. So can we hit him with quiz number 2? There we are. The names of Redlanders who paid what Abraham Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion are inscribed at a memorial in which Redlands Park? Is it Ford Park, Prospect Park, Jenny Davis Park, or Veterans Park? And we'll give you a few seconds to figure that one out. Alrighty, what are the results? Again, majority of folk got it. 21 get it right for Jenny Davis. Yeah, I threw that curveball with Veterans Park. I don't think there is a Veterans Park. Nothing on Ford Park, but not bad. 60%. Very, very, very good. Alrighty. All right. Again, it's part of my D-Day presentation, but we know of one Redlander, Peter Hernandez, who landed at Utah Beach over there on the far left as part of the 4th Infantry Division. He survived D-Day, approximately 2,200 American casualties on D-Day, but there was plenty of hard fighting. Just getting ashore on day 1 was not the objective. It was getting a lodgment in France, and in particular clearing that port of Cherbourg in the upper left there. Peter Hernandez and his 4th Infantry Division would make a right turn after the little orange lines you see there and head towards Cherbourg. And in the forests around Cherbourg on June 22nd, he would be killed in action. I don't know the particulars of that. Unfortunately, we've tried as much as we can. He doesn't have any relatives that we've been able to contact. But we did, through last year, find a high school image of him in our yearbook. I apologize, it's not part of this PowerPoint. But he's buried at Hillside Cemetery, and every Memorial Day, my wife and I kind of adopted him as our grave that we make sure is cleaned and put a flag in his memory there. All right, so on with the Normandy campaign. So landing ashore, in effect, was the easy part, but the Germans would send in reinforcements, including some of their toughest fighters, the so-called Waffen SS, and the Allies were bottled up in this little lodgement in Normandy for the better part of 6 weeks. All right, so before we see what broke out of there, let me give some recommendations about movies that talk about D-Day. Most folk, I would assume, are familiar with Longest Day, all-star cast, a lot of, based on the Cornelius Ryan book, so very faithful to the book. And from my perspective, the best part of it, it was filmed on the sites. So you can't beat some of the verisimilitude of seeing places like San Mariglis, where the actual paratroopers dropped, is filmed there. And speaking of paratroopers, the miniseries Band of Brothers, it'll be coming up in a couple other of the slides, but very excellent miniseries, and the episodes in dealing with D-Day and the fighting in Normandy. I commend those to your attention. And there's probably no better cinematic representation of the slaughter that did take place on Omaha Beach than the opening 30 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. Again, very gruesome, but war in itself is gruesome. And I believe if you're going to try to contemplate whether to go to war or not to go to war, you should know exactly what you're getting into. And R-rated movies kind of do demonstrate the horror of war that PG movies do not in their entirety. All right, so moving on. As I mentioned, the Allies were jammed or could not get out of the breakout of the area in Normandy, the lodgement there that showed on the last map. Finally, in late July of 1944, about 6-7 weeks later, a massive aerial bombing campaign of 1,000 bombers would drop bombs on the German line. Upwards of 250 Americans were killed in short drops of the bombs and misfires, but it crushed a hole in the German line and allowed American tanks under the command of George Patton to race through the gap. One thing on the image on the lower right there, you can notice the like the plow device on the front of the tank. That was called a Rhino. American ingenuity. A sergeant by the name of Cutler came up with the idea. These hedges, thick hedges, were causing the Allies' inability to go right through the fields. They had to go on the roads, and they would be subject to ambushes by the Germans. So Sergeant Cutler came up with the idea of welding bits of iron from the German defenses on the beach that had been overrun to the front of tanks and allowed them to uproot their way through the hedges and help cause the breakthrough. But it was the aerial bombardment really that also opened up the front. And the image on the left is the town of Saint-Lô in France, which was almost completely obliterated by the bombardment. And unfortunately, there were civilians in these French towns. Upwards of 40,000 French civilians would be killed during the 3 years of the war, the vast majority in 1944, by Allied bombing. Again, thought to be a necessary evil to win the war. And so, maybe surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, de Gaulle and the Free French did not complain about these bombings, considering it to be necessary. All right, again, the breakout scenes of Operation Cobra when they cracked the line are very well depicted in the movie Patton. Commend that to your Italian attention. And again, the map here shows the blue are the Americans, the red are the British. And then from August 1st onward, American and British forces raced through France and the German front collapsed. Paris itself was liberated on August 25th. Eisenhower very deftly allowed a Free French division to have the honor of doing the actual liberating into the town. So the City of Light was freed after 4 years of Nazi occupation. Allied forces then rumbled through eastern France, liberated Belgium, and approached the borders of the Third Reich itself. Now, in terms of a movie depiction of the events of the liberation of Paris, I recommend this film here, Is Paris Burning? kind of a documentary style, black and white, but that allows them to put in real images into the movie itself. And again, a very compelling movie about the liberation of Paris. All right, again, we cannot forget that at the same time D-Day is taking place and the liberation of Paris, the Soviet Union is unleashing a massive offensive. The Germans were forced to take a lot of their reinforcements to deal with the D-Day invasion. So as a result, they were not caught by surprise on the exact third anniversary of the German invasion of Russia, June 22nd, 1944. The Red Army crushed the German so-called Army Group Center with a combination of their very efficient T-34 tanks, their Sturmovik attack aircraft, liberated the province and now country of Belarus, approached the borders of East Prussia, and also liberated parts of the Baltic states. An entire German army, upwards of 200,000 men, were captured en masse and paraded through the streets of Moscow, as you see there in the upper left. Again, a devastating blow to the Germans, but still they fought on. During this period, I was going to have a slide on it, but we got a lot to cover. But during this period, the Germans attempted to assassinate, the German army attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler, and that would be a failure with a bomb plot. And really unfortunate for the world, and particularly for Germany, that assassination did not take place, because the killing would go on massively, and particularly for Germans on the home front. A movie for that, by the way, I recommend strongly is Valkyrie with Tom Cruise. All right, so the Allies are on the Western Front. We're going to have to make a decision as to where we're going to go next, because their supply problems are causing the Allies cannot advance on a so-called broad front. They're going to have to make a determination who's going to get the majority of the gasoline in particular. And Eisenhower, to his credit or discredit, depending on your perspective, listens to the usually timid Bernard Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery, the British general. And the usually timid Montgomery comes up with a scheme to use the Allied airborne army to drop paratroopers on the bridges in Holland over the Maas Wall and Rhine rivers, and seize those bridges with paratroopers, then send their army around the so-called Siegfried line, you see that on the right there, of German defenses, and thus get into the so-called Ruhr district, the Ruhrgebiet, where all of most of Germany's factories were. So a very bold scheme, again, using the Allied airborne army, which had been used at D-Day and also in Italy and North Africa, but used in massive scale here. 2 full American airborne divisions, 1 British airborne division would be dropped on these bridges in this bold effort to basically end the war early with this bold effort. But as many of you know, it would be unsuccessful for a variety of reasons. The British in particular at Arnhem would be all but wiped out, American casualties as well, and the effort would be a failure. Again, the movie, the miniseries Band of Brothers is a great depiction of the American 101st Airborne, their role in this engagement, and the Cornelius Ryan's book, Bridge Too Far, was made into a movie in 1977. I recommend that strongly to your attention, because unlike movies today that rely strictly on CGI, computer-generated effects, they used real weapons and real extras to depict this very dramatic battle that resulted in Allied defeat, but might have ended the war earlier. Let's see here, West Wall. Yeah, this might be a time for quiz number 3. I want to make sure we get those quizzes in. Quizmaster Nathan, do you want to hit us with quiz number 3? All righty. The U.S. Army liberated which Nazi concentration camp? Was it Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, or Treblinka? And I'll give you some time to put in your guesses. All right, and the answer is, oh, this was a little bit more confusing one for folk. Yeah, a lot of people thought it might have been Auschwitz, but that was the Soviet army in the east. It's in Poland today. Dachau was in Bavaria, and where our forces were. Bergen-Belsen was in the north of Germany. The Brits liberated that camp. And Treblinka is in far Poland as well. So that's the Soviet army there. Thank you for participating. All right, on the Western Front, that Siegfried line I referenced on the last slide was a series of fortifications, including these little concrete pylons known as dragon's teeth that would prevent tanks from overrolling them. The Germans built this entire public works project basically in about a year and a half in the entirety of the German border. And there are huge remnants of it still visible today. I have visited it on a couple of occasions on some of my tours. And we at some point thought about, good thing we didn't actually, arranging a tour to these German sites for the 75th anniversary. Would have all been canceled due to COVID. But they are interesting sites to see. The one little area that I have visited in the past is called the Hurtgen Forest. And there's a slide coming up in a second about that, where Americans fought for the better part of 3 months. But this is a very important trail called the Kahl River Trail from 1944, and that was fought over by the Americans and the Germans. And this is what it looks like today. Again, remarkably still intact. And one of the more interesting artifacts I've ever come across is this embedded Sherman tank tread that is embedded in the trail to this day. A very interesting artifact. So these German defenses pose a major issue for the Allies as to how to break into Germany proper. Germans brought up reinforcements, and the combination of the weather turning were able to stall the Allies in this area known as the Hurtgen Forest. It's right here. There's Holland, where the the Market Garden effort failed, and France over here. So the lines stalled in this Hurtgen Forest for the better part of 3 months. And in fighting in the trees, the American 9th Army suffered heavy casualties, 30,000 casualties. And it's a battle few people know about. And American morale suffered when attack after attack failed. It almost reminds me of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, World War I, similar casualties, similar failure of initial success, and American morale suffered throughout this battle as we were unable to gain any ground in getting through the force and the defenses of the Siegfried line. There's a HBO movie that talks about the Hurtgen Forest called When Trumpets Fade. It's a low-budget movie, but I think it does a pretty good job in demonstrating the depth of how bad American morale had become as a result of this green hell, as it was called, fighting in the forest. All right. In the midst of that fighting, back on the home front, an important development took place. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won his 4th term. As you can see from the red state, blue state map on the side, it was not close electorally. Popular vote fairly close, 53-45. But electorally, Thomas Dewey could not defeat FDR. You see the poster, Sam says he wants FDR to stay and finish the job. So the last 4-term president that we're going to have, thanks to the constitutional amendment changing it. All right, so out of nowhere, with the Germans seemingly on their last legs, Hitler had deliberately withheld reinforcements, tanks in particular, and built up a reserve army that he decided in a desperate gesture to launch in the quiet Ardennes forest area. You see it there on the map, Luxembourg in the corner of Belgium there, with the goal of somehow breaking through the Allied line, thinly held line, where the 8th Corps is, and capturing Brussels, but more importantly, Antwerp, which is a major Allied supply port, and then capturing all the Allied armies, the 1st, 9th, and the British Army and the Canadian Army up in Holland there, capturing them all. A desperate gamble that really had little chance of success and wasted all of Germany's final reserves. But it did catch the Americans by surprise, and the Germans did break through. Heavy casualties were inflicted, but they got no further than the Meuse River there, which is where Namur is in the middle. I can point to it. I've got the cursor here, right? Yeah, where Namur is, got no farther than here before American reinforcements and the clearing of the winter weather allowed the battle to be stopped. Now, I know some of you are UQA people there are going to say, hey, what's going on with that picture there, Don? And you're absolutely right. That picture is from the movie Battle of the Bulge, and real weapons aficionados will realize that those are American post-war tanks, not German tanks. But still, I recommend the movie Battle of the Bulge. So it wasn't just December of 1944. The American counterattack throughout the month of January would cause major casualties. You see Bastogne there being held out by the 101st Airborne. So yes, that movie, Battle of the Bulge, a good depiction of the battle, even though it was filmed in Spain, not in Belgium, and with the different tanks, but still talks about a lot of the issues. The Band of Brothers miniseries features the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and that's an important aspect of the story. Let's see here. Now, again, featured in the movie Battle of the Bulge, and really scarred me as a kid, is a depiction of the Malmedy massacre, just why are Americans being murdered in cold blood by German machine guns. Again, the Waffen-SS, notorious for atrocities on the Eastern Front, ran into they were coming in this direction, Kaufgruppe Piper, ran into an American convoy at this crossroads near Malmedy. And again, the exact spark is in dispute, but the Americans surrendered and were gathered in a field right in here, the so-called massacre field. And again, the Germans say some Americans started running. The Americans again say that Germans driving by on their tanks indiscriminately opened fire in the field. People started running after the fire started shooting, and 84 Americans would be killed, but there were survivors, and the reports from those survivors galvanized American resistance, and there was a take no prisoners order issued against the Waffen-SS, basically, and Americans resolved to get revenge for this incident. Ironically, again, here it's the graves detail when the area was reconquered by the Americans in January, snow had covered all the bodies, but they disinterred all of them, and many are buried in the cemeteries of Belgium and the Netherlands. The memorial there just had a 75th anniversary ceremony with the Belgians and the Americans in December. The memorial's across the street from the actual massacre field itself. But again, it's an important part of our story. A very small movie, extremely low budget movie called Saints and Soldiers depicts the Malmedy massacre, and I think in a much more realistic method than the Battle of the Bulge film does. So I commend that to your attention if you find that at your Netflix or video store. They don't have video stores anymore, what am I saying? In addition to the Malmedy massacre, there was a lesser known massacre perpetrated by the Waffen-SS. They're there up in the upper left there, against an African-American group of field artillerymen. Now, the U.S. Army was, of course, segregated during World War II, but there were numerous African-American artillery, tank, and infantry units segregated with largely white officers. The image here is members of the 333 Field Artillery Battery, excuse me. They would actually, the majority of their men would be in that Bastogne pocket, and it was their artillery that allowed the 101st Airborne to hold out as long as they did. Really, they should get more credit, and there would be a good movie in the making. But 11 of them were captured by the Waffen-SS, and unlike the Malmedy massacre, where there are disputes, there's no disputes thanks to Belgian civilians who witnessed it. They were brutally beaten to death and murdered in the small town. Now, the Belgian family who witnessed this made it their mission to put up a monument in honor of these men, and that finally took place in the 1990s. And my nephew and I found this monument when we were over in the Bastogne area a few years ago. And you see the flagpoles. One has an American flag on it, the other with a European flag. The American flag was partly falling off, and I was proud that we were able to, one, find this monument. It's completely off the beaten track, and two, restore the American flag to it. One small little anecdote with an oddity to it. You see here written on the 17th of December 1944, 11 U.S. Soldaten for the SS erschossen. That means they were shot by the SS. But what's interesting about it, in addition to the names of the soldiers, I can't be the only monument. This symbol of the lightning bolts of the SS is forbidden in Germany and France, I imagine in Belgium as well. But again, the private monument, you can see it's very nicely done, elected to put the SS's in lightning bolts. Kind of odd. All right. The Germans paid for their decision to commit all their tanks to the Battle of the Bulge because that dramatically weakened their forces on the Eastern Front. And in January 1945, the Red Army attacked the Red Army Blitzkrieg. In the span of 3 weeks, they went from the Vistula River here outside of Warsaw, overran most of East Prussia, and burst to within 40 miles of Berlin itself on the Oder River by the first week in February. This incredible Blitzkrieg accomplishment, again, the Soviet Red Army deserves credit, but where our Lend-Lease really paid off, we gave them tanks, we gave them planes, not our best tanks and planes, but what we did do is give them our best Ford trucks and GM trucks, and that allowed them to mobilize their infantry instead of having to ride tanks like you see here. They were put on trucks, and that was what allowed them to create this Blitzkrieg, motorizing their infantry. But Germany was really on death's door at this point, but still the Nazis would fight on because they knew, many of them would be executed if they surrendered, and they were able to convince the German people that the doctrine of unconditional surrender would convince them to keep fighting. So those German people would suffer grievously in the last 6 months of the war in particular. The world's worst naval catastrophe would take place when a German passenger liner, the Wilhelm Gustloff, would be sunk by a Soviet submarine with upwards of 9,000 or 10,000 civilian refugees drowned in one fell swoop in the Baltic Sea. Millions would flee their homes in East Prussia, Silesia, in advance of the Red Army, who wanted revenge for German atrocities inflicted during the early years of the war. Unfortunately, all armies commit atrocities, and particularly the crime of rape, but the level of mass rapes in Eastern Germany in this period rose to incredible levels, and including Polish civilians, including Jews who had been hiding for 3 years. The Red Army went wild. In the midst of that, the bombing campaign elevated, and these images here are from the famous or / notorious bombing of Dresden in February 14th, 1945. The city was packed with refugees. For decades, the accepted death figure was somewhere between 75 and 100,000. The Germans revised those figures, and the new accepted number is 25,000 killed in one night by both the Royal Air Force, who bombed at night, and the American Air Force, who attacked the next day. The image on the lower left, again, is a pile of corpses being burned. I've got a neighbor here who's buzzing on my door here, but maybe my wife can handle them. Well, because we're almost done here. We got a few more minutes. A movie that dramatically depicts the events of Slaughterhouse 5. The events of the bombing of Dresden is the movie Slaughterhouse 5 from the 1970s, filmed mostly in Prague, which was not damaged severely in the war, standing in for Dresden in 1945. All right, so in the West, in early March 1945, the Allied forces, having defeated the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge, plunged through the Hurtgen Forest up to the Rhine River itself, the last major defense line that the Germans could erect. And the Germans blew all the bridges on the wide Rhine River, except for this one bridge here, the Ludendorff Bridge in the middle of Germany at Remagen here. And amazingly, the explosives that were supposed to set off the destruction of the bridge failed to completely damage the bridge, and brave Americans from the 9th Army went out onto that damaged bridge and seized it, grabbed the other side, and allowed the bridgehead to be formed on that Remagen bridgehead there to plunge further into Germany. This is the close-up of the Remagen Bridge. Ironically, in 1918, this had been the sector that the Americans held in the occupation of Germany. These are American troops. I have this slide up there because my wife's grandfather was part of this occupation army, and we like to think maybe he's included in this photo here. Nathan, time for maybe that last quiz, and we'll try to wrap things up here. I've got a couple more slides and I'll run out of time. All right, which presidential son was a D-Day hero and is buried in the American cemetery in Normandy? Was it William Howard Taft Jr., Woodrow Wilson Jr., Warren Harding Jr., or Theodore Roosevelt Jr.? I don't know. Give you a clue. He's played by Henry Fonda in the movie. And the answer is most everybody got it. Most everybody, 72%. Teddy Roosevelt Jr., the son of the president, hero in World War I, by the way, combat hero, wounded there, lands at D-Day, helps direct the forces of the right spot at Utah Beach, is given a division command of his own, but dies of a heart attack while visiting his son in around Cherbourg just a couple weeks after D-Day. So thank you, Nathan, for that, and thank you for everybody participating in the quiz. Just a couple more slides here. Thank you for your patience. All right, I'll go movie-wise. That important crossing of the bridge, another good movie that I recommend that doesn't use CGI. This is a still from it, filmed in the Czech Republic in 1968. Is Bridge at Remagen with George Segal and Ben Gazzara. Again, depicts the bravery of the Americans who seized that bridge. I commend that to your attention. All right, as both the Americans and the Russians and the British drove deeper into Germany, the horrors of the Nazi death camps were revealed. Again, I apologize for the shocking image on the right, but again, you cannot understand the Holocaust, in my view, without realizing the millions, 5.1 million Jews, millions of others that were murdered by the Nazis in these death camps. And if anything demonstrated to the Americans that came to liberate the camps that the sacrifice was worthwhile, it was the reaction. Here is a small camp, and the inmates have erected a handmade American flag to thank the American soldiers who had liberated them. So again, very worthwhile to visit these camps if you can, if you go to Europe to see the shocking horrors that were perpetrated by the Nazis. The Holocaust has had many very good movies that depict all aspects of it. Again, a small grouping of the ones I would recommend to you. Of course, Schindler's List, the great Steven Spielberg movie. Another Best Picture winner is The Pianist from Polanski, regardless of his personal life. This is an excellent depiction from one man's perspective of what it would have been like to be a Jew on the run in Warsaw in the 1940s. And then The Band of Brothers has a great scene of the liberation of the camps, one of their episodes. And this little known movie here with the now late Rutger Hauer, Escape from Sobibor, one of the death camps in the Far East, where the only major uprising that took place, Red Army soldiers, as portrayed by Rutger Hauer, were sent to this extermination camp of Sobibor, and they organized an uprising that killed Nazi guards, and upwards of 100 people managed to escape from the camp. So I commend that to your attention. All right, wrapping things up here. The war still dragged on, even though Germany is on its last legs, and Russian and German forces, American forces, excuse me, are deep into the country. In the midst of that, President Roosevelt dies from cerebral hemorrhage, and Harry Truman takes over, as you see in the image there. And Hitler was gleeful when this news was relayed, that thought somehow or another that would stop the Allied effort, that it did not. Interestingly here, this headline here, 9th Army 50 miles from Berlin, that the Americans were getting deep into Berlin, and the Russians would not launch their big attack into Berlin proper 40 miles away on the Oder River until 4 days later. So again, some people have speculated that why did the Americans liberate Berlin? We don't have time for that issue today, but people will be debating about that for a while. So the Red Army did attack on April 16th, and after heavy casualties, broke through 4 days later, invested Berlin on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. And as you see the map here, Germany's on their last legs, but the Reichstag itself would fall, the red flag, Red Army getting revenge for the violence that had been inflicted upon Russia. So finally, on April 30th, the news the world was waiting for took place when Hitler committed suicide, just as the Red Army was about to burst into his bunker, and Hitler was dead and the perpetrator of the European war. But still, the war dragged on. Oh, before I get to that, another movie I'd strongly recommend is the movie Downfall from about 10 years ago in German, featuring Bruno Ganz with an incredible depiction of the basically the last 10 days of Hitler's life. All right, so finally, Germany would fight on for the better part of a week. Individual armies would surrender, but the major surrender ceremony would take place in Rheims, France, 75 years ago, when Jodl And the German representatives would go to Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters and sign the surrender documents. Stalin was not pleased by this, by the way. The Soviet representative at the surrender ceremony would later disappear at some stage into the gulags for not delaying the ceremony until more higher-ranking Soviet representatives could be there. And they insisted on a separate surrender ceremony the next day, May 9th, in Berlin proper, featuring Field Marshal Keitel and Field Marshal Zhukov from the Soviets. But the war would end on that date, and the world would celebrate. There was Winston Churchill in London with the V for Victory, and crowds would gather in New York City, and a small gathering took place here in Redlands as well. Here is the world's reaction across some of the newspaper headlines to the VE celebration, but our own Redlands Daily Facts, of all the newspapers I found, that they were the only ones to actually point to an exact minute that the war ended at 3:01 p.m., being an afternoon paper at that time. And you can see some of the headlines there, so Redlanders reacted with joy. Let's see, yes, and so inside that very Redlands Daily Facts paper is a full-page ad from the Harris Company that I found interesting. Here we see Mein Kampf in flames being burned down on the bottom here, burning books, interesting. And the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, of course, the Lincoln quote. And then down here is a moment of reflection and reverent recognition of the solemnity of this moment of victory in Europe. Let us dedicate ourselves to the task ahead with renewed vigor and determination. And that vigor and determination was the war on Japan. That war had to continue, and you see some propaganda posters here that would remind people of that. I hope you enjoyed what we put together here today. People ask what VE Day is, or let your colleagues, your children, your grandchildren know about the sacrifice of people who ended that scourge of Nazism 75 years ago yesterday.